At just 20 years old, with an undefeated record of 38 fights and 35 knockouts, James "Lightning" Chen was Brooklyn's most feared amateur boxer. Now, wearing a simple hoodie and carrying a weathered backpack across Princeton University's campus, he looked nothing like the fighter whose lightning-fast combinations had made him a legend in New York's underground boxing scene. But his carefully planned escape from the boxing world was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. The historic campus sprawled before him, its Gothic architecture and ivy-covered walls representing everything his life in the ring wasn't. Peaceful, prestigious, predictable, students hustled between buildings, their animated conversations about research projects and upcoming exams floating through the air. James adjusted his simple black hoodie, conscious of how different it was from the championship belts collecting dust in his grandmother's Bushwick apartment. The late September breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and new beginnings, a stark contrast to the familiar mix of leather and sweat he'd known for the past decade. 3 months ago, he had shocked the boxing world by turning down a 6-figure professional contract. The sports blogs had exploded with speculation, and his former manager still called weekly, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails about throwing away his prime years. None of them understood that every time James wrapped his hands before a fight, he found himself more fascinated by the anatomy of his wrists and knuckles than the upcoming bout. That curiosity had led him to ace his community college classes while still maintaining his grueling training schedule, earning him not just knockouts, but also a perfect GPA. "You must be James Chen," called out a cheerful voice from the administration. In building's entrance, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes approached him, tablet in hand. "I'm Mrs. Harrison from Student Services. We're so pleased to have you joining us this semester." She didn't mention his perfect GPA from community college or the glowing recommendations from his professors, and certainly nothing about the viral videos of his lightning-fast combinations that had earned him his nickname. "Thank you, Ma'am," James replied softly, his voice carrying none of the intensity that had once echoed through Brooklyn's underground boxing scene. He accepted the orientation package she offered, his calloused hands, the ones that had earned him scholarships through countless tournament victories, now holding campus maps and class schedules. As Mrs. Harrison guided him through the registration process, James couldn't help but notice the stark differences between this world and his last. Here, success wasn't measured in knockouts or ticket sales, but in research papers and lab results. The other students around him carried themselves with a different kind of confidence, one built on academic achievements rather than physical prowess. "Your pre-med advisor, Dr. Reynolds, is especially looking forward to meeting you," Mrs. Harrison mentioned, pulling up his schedule on her tablet. "Your essay on sports-related traumatic brain injuries was quite impressive." James nodded, remembering the hours spent researching between training sessions, his grandmother bringing him coffee as he pored over medical journals late into the night. His grandmother had been his biggest supporter, both in and out of the ring. When he'd told her about wanting to become a doctor, she'd simply smiled and said, "Lightning, you've always had healing hands, even if you've been using them differently." She was the one who'd helped him apply to Princeton, who'd understood why he needed to leave the boxing world behind. Walking toward his assigned dorm in Wilson College, James observed his new peers. A group of students debated quantum mechanics on the lawn, their enthusiasm reminding him of his old teammates analyzing fight footage. Near the library, a young woman practiced violin, her fingers dancing across the strings with the same precision. He once used to throw combinations. Different worlds, different skills, but the same dedication. His new room was on the 3rd floor, a corner unit overlooking the courtyard. The space was modest but neat, with 2 beds, desks and dressers arranged symmetrically. James's roommate hadn't arrived yet, giving him a moment of solitude to unpack and reflect. He carefully placed his textbooks on the desk. Anatomy, organic. Chemistry, physics, each one representing a step toward his new dream. At the bottom of his backpack, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was a small photo of him and his grandmother after his last amateur fight. He was still in his boxing gear, holding his final championship belt. But what caught his eye now was his expression. Not the usual post-fight euphoria, but a quiet determination. He'd known then that it would be his last bout, that his future lay in healing rather than hurting. James pinned the photo to his bulletin board, then stepped back to survey his new home. The bare walls and standard-issue furniture held infinite possibilities. Here he could reinvent himself, focus on his studies, and work toward becoming the doctor he'd always dreamed of being. No one needed to know about the lightning-fast hands that had made him famous in another life, but as he began arranging his belongings, a commotion in the hallway caught his attention. Loud voices and laughter approached his door, a reminder. The college life came with its own kind of ring, its own battles and challenges. James took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders unconsciously, a fighter's habit he hadn't quite shed. His new life was about to begin, and while he hoped to keep his past in the shadows, something told him that Princeton had other plans. The first week at Princeton passed in a blur of orientation sessions, campus tours, and syllabus reviews. James quickly fell into a routine that felt both foreign and familiar. Every morning, he woke at 5 a.m. Old habits died hard, but instead of hitting the heavy bag, he used the quiet hours to study in the empty common room, the pale dawn, light gradually filling the space as he highlighted key passages in his textbooks. His roommate, David Park, was a sophomore computer science major who spent most of his time either coding or playing online games. The two formed an easy friendship, built on mutual respect for each other's space and David's complete disinterest in anything athletic. To him, James was just another pre-med student, albeit one who seemed unusually disciplined about his schedule. "Man, I don't know how you do it," David said one evening, watching James prepare for his 9 p.m. workout. "Most people are winding down now, but you're like a machine." James just shrugged, carefully wrapping his hands beneath his sleeves, an old habit he couldn't shake, even though he now only did basic calisthenics and light bag work. The campus. Gym became James's sanctuary, especially during off hours when few students were around. He'd found a quiet corner with a speed bag and some basic weights, where he could maintain his fitness without drawing attention. He kept his movements deliberately slower, less crisp than his fighting days, though even at half speed his natural grace was evident. It was during one of these late-night sessions that he met Sarah Mitchell. She was cleaning up equipment in the gym, her Princeton athletic staff shirt suggesting she worked there part-time. James noticed her watching him hit the speed bag, her head tilted slightly as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Your rhythm is perfect," she said, approaching him. "Most people just slap at it randomly, but you've got real technique." James immediately slowed his pace, letting the bag's momentum die down. "I just like to stay in shape," he replied, reaching for his towel. Sarah raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "I'm the student athletic trainer here. I've seen plenty of people just staying in shape, and none of them move like you do." She extended her hand. "Sarah Mitchell, by the way. I'm studying sports medicine." James hesitated before shaking her hand, noticing her firm grip and the confident way she carried herself. "James Chen, pre-med." He could see the questions forming in her eyes and quickly added, "The gym's closing soon, right? I should get going." "Actually, I'm just starting my shift. Night owl hours work better with my class schedule." She gestured. "At the bag. You know, we have a boxing club here at Princeton. Nothing serious, just students learning the basics. With your form, you'd make a great instructor." James felt his chest tighten. "Not really my thing," he said, starting to unwrap his hands. "I prefer studying to sparring." The lie felt heavy on his tongue, but he'd gotten better at telling it. Over the past few weeks, Sarah leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. "Fair enough, but if you ever change your mind, they meet on Tuesday evenings. Most of them could use help just learning to throw a proper jab." She smiled, and James couldn't help but notice how her eyes crinkled at the corners. "Besides, it looks lonely working out here by yourself every night." Before James could respond, the gym doors burst open as a group of athletes walked in, their loud voices echoing off the walls. They were wearing Princeton wrestling team jackets, their confident swagger suggesting they considered the gym their territory, even at this late hour. "Hey, Sarah!" one of them called out. "Still babysitting the equipment?" The others laughed, but Sarah just rolled her eyes. "Someone has to make sure you guys don't break everything, Mike." Her tone was light, but James could sense an underlying tension. Mike, a powerfully built guy with a crew cut, noticed James. "Who's the new guy? Kind of late for a workout, isn't it?" His tone carried a hint of challenge that James recognized all too well from his days in the boxing scene. "Just finishing up," James said quietly, gathering his things. He could feel Mike's eyes on him, assessing, probably noting his athletic build despite the loose workout clothes. James kept his movements casual, deliberately lacking the fluid grace he naturally possessed. "You should join us sometime," Mike said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "We could always use new sparring partners." The invitation sounded more like a threat, but James just nodded politely and headed for the door. "Hey!" Sarah called after him. "Same time tomorrow?" James paused, considering having someone notice his technique was dangerous, but something about Sarah's straightforward manner made him hesitate to brush her off completely. "Maybe," he replied, offering a small smile, "if I can get through all my anatomy readings." As he walked back to his dorm through the quiet campus, James couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed anonymity was already beginning to crack. Sarah's observations were too accurate, and Mike's challenging attitude stirred something in him that he'd been trying to suppress. Back in his room, David was still awake, the blue light from his multiple monitors casting shadows on the wall. "A good workout?" he asked without looking away from his screens. "Yeah," James replied, settling at his desk and opening his textbook. But as he stared at the diagrams of muscle groups and nerve pathways, his mind kept drifting back to the gym. Sarah's invitation to the boxing club tugged at him, while Mike's pseudo-challenge echoed in his ears. He'd come to Princeton to escape the fighting world, but perhaps that world wasn't quite ready to let him go. The Princeton University Student Center hummed with energy as music thumped through speakers and students packed the large common area. For the semester's biggest welcome party, James stood near the refreshment table, nursing a cup of punch and watching the crowd with careful eyes. Another old habit from his fighting days, always staying aware of his surroundings. Sarah had convinced him to come, insisting that he needed to actually experience college life instead of just studying it. She now stood beside him, providing running commentary on various student groups and campus dynamics. Her presence made the crowded space more bearable, though James still felt out of place. "See that group over there?" Sarah pointed toward a cluster of athletes holding court in the center of the room. "That's Mike and his wrestling team buddies. They basically consider themselves Princeton royalty." James noticed Mike from the gym, now wearing a Letterman jacket and surrounded by admirers. "They seem to have earned their reputation," James observed, watching two of the wrestlers playfully demonstrate holds on each other, drawing cheers from the crowd. The moves were precise, technical. These weren't just showboats, they were serious athletes. "Maybe," Sarah conceded, "but that doesn't give them the right to act like they own the place." Last semester, Mike sent 3 guys to the campus clinic, just from friendly sparring matches. She made air quotes around the word friendly. Of course, nobody reported him officially. His dad's some big donor to the athletic department. James felt his jaw tighten, but kept his expression neutral. He'd seen this type before in the boxing world, talented fighters who used their skills to intimidate rather than excel. Before he could respond, David appeared beside them, looking unusually agitated. "Hey," David said, his voice low. "You might want to check on your friend Tommy from Biolab. Mike and his guys are giving him a hard time out in the courtyard." James hadn't known Tommy long, just a quiet freshman he'd partnered with for lab work, but the concern in David's voice was clear. James set down his cup. "Show me." Sarah followed as David led them through the crowd toward the courtyard doors. The music faded as they stepped outside, replaced by the sound of mocking laughter and what James recognized as the tone of someone trying to sound brave while scared. Tommy stood backed against a stone wall surrounded by Mike and 3 other wrestlers. Though shorter than his tormentors, Tommy kept his chin up, but James could see his hands trembling. "Come on, future doctor," Mike was saying, his voice thick with fake friendliness. "Show us that perfect form you were bragging about in class. What was it you said about wrestlers having sloppy technique?" I never said that," Tommy stammered. "I was just discussing different athletic training methods for my paper." "Leave him alone, Mike." Sarah's voice cut through the tension. "Don't you have some weights to go lift or something?" Mike turned, his grin widening when he saw James standing there. "Well, if it isn't the mystery gym guy, perfect timing. Maybe you can help settle this. Your lab buddy here thinks he's an expert on combat sports, claims boxing is more technical than wrestling." He took a step toward Tommy. "We were just about to give him a practical demonstration." James felt the familiar calm settling over him, the one that always preceded a fight. He kept his voice level. "Sounds like a misunderstanding. Tommy's paper was about injury prevention in contact sports. He wasn't insulting anyone." "Oh, so you're his spokesperson now?" Mike stepped away from Tommy, focusing his attention on James. The other wrestlers spread out slightly, creating a loose circle. "You know, I've been wondering about you. Nobody trains like you do just to stay in shape." James maintained his relaxed posture, but his senses heightened, automatically noting distances, positions, potential threats, skills honed through countless fights. "There's nothing to wonder about, I just like working out." Mike moved closer, using his slight height advantage to look down at James. "Then you wouldn't mind showing us some moves? You know, since you're such good friends with the boxing expert here?" He gestured mockingly at Tommy. "I'm not looking for trouble," James said quietly, but his stance shifted subtly, weight balanced perfectly, another unconscious habit. "No trouble," Mike's smile turned predatory. "Just a friendly sparring match, tomorrow morning 6 a.m. at the gym. Show us what you got." He glanced at Tommy. "Unless you'd rather I continue my discussion with your friend here?" The implied threat hung in the air. James could feel Sarah and David's tension, see Tommy's fear. The smart play was to walk away, to protect his cover and his future. But walking away meant Tommy would face these guys alone, and James had seen too many bullies triumph through others' silence. "Fine," James said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made Mike's smile falter slightly. "Tomorrow morning. But we do this properly, with rules in the ring." Mike recovered quickly, clapping James on the shoulder hard enough to make most people stumble. James didn't move an inch. "Looking forward to it, mystery man. Don't forget your mouthguard." He laughed, leading his crew back inside, leaving Tommy sagging with relief against the wall. "James, you don't have to do this," Sarah said, touching his arm. "We can report them to the administration." "No," James cut her off gently. "This needs to end. Some lessons can't be taught in a classroom." He turned to Tommy. "You okay?" Tommy nodded, still shaken. "I'm sorry, I never meant to." "It's not your fault," James assured him. "Get some rest. Everything will be fine tomorrow." As they walked back inside, Sarah kept glancing at James, her expression thoughtful. "You're different," she said finally. "When you were facing them down, it was like you became another person." James didn't respond. Back in his dorm room that night, he unwrapped a package he'd promised himself he'd never open at Princeton. His old hand wraps, still carrying the faint scent of resin and victory. As he went through the familiar motion of wrapping his hands, he thought about his grandmother's words when he'd left Brooklyn. Sometimes running from who you are means running from who you could be. Tomorrow morning, Princeton would learn exactly who James "Lightning" Chen was. He just hoped he wouldn't lose everything he'd worked for in the process. At 5:30 a.m., the campus gym was eerily quiet. James sat alone in the locker room, methodically, wrapping his hands with the practiced precision of someone who had done this countless times before. Each wrap around his knuckles felt like adding a piece of his old self back into place. Sarah arrived first, slipping into the locker room with a concerned expression. "You don't have to go through with this," she said, watching his hands move with practiced efficiency. "The way you wrapped those... You've done this before, haven't you? Really done this?" Before James could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from his grandmother. "Remember who you are, Lightning, not just what you can do." He smiled faintly, tucking the phone away. "Sarah," he said quietly, "there's something you should know." But the locker room door burst open as Mike and his crew strutted in, already in their workout gear. A small crowd of students followed, word of the confrontation having spread through late-night texts and social media. "Ready for your lesson, mystery man?" Mike called out, bouncing on his toes with nervous energy, but his confident smirk faltered slightly as he watched James stand, noting the professional precision of his hand wraps and the calm focus in his eyes. The growing crowd of spectators parted as James walked toward the ring. Sarah caught up with him, grabbing his arm. "James, wait. I did some digging last night. I found videos." She pulled out her phone, showing him a paused YouTube clip. On the screen, a younger James stood in a Brooklyn boxing ring, his hands raised in victory. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Because this isn't who I want to be anymore," he replied, his voice low. "But sometimes we don't get to choose." Mike was already in the ring, performing exaggerated stretches for his appreciative audience. "Hope you're ready to learn the difference between real fighting and playing boxer," he called out. James slipped through the ropes with fluid grace, his movements suddenly sharper, more precise. The change was subtle but unmistakable, like a switch being flipped. A few students who had been watching boxing videos of Lightning Chen last night began whispering, phones coming out to record. "Last chance to walk away," James offered, quietly, only for Mike's ears. "No shame in it." Mike responded with a rush forward, throwing a wild haymaker that James slipped past with barely a movement. The wrestler followed with a grab for James's legs, but found nothing but air as James pivoted away, his footwork making the dodge look effortless. "Stand and fight," Mike growled, frustrated by his inability to land anything. "Are you sure?" James asked, his voice still calm. When Mike charged again, James finally threw his first punch, a lightning-fast jab that snapped Mike's head back and stopped him in his tracks. The crowd gasped at the speed and precision. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Holy shit, it's really him, that's Lightning Chen." The name rippled through the spectators as more students pulled up videos on their phones, comparing the footage to the scene before them. Mike, hearing the murmurs, hesitated. "Who? Your technique's sloppy," James said, his voice taking on the tone of an instructor. "You telegraph your moves, overextend your punches, and drop your guard. In a real fight, any of those mistakes could..." He demonstrated with another, blindingly fast combination that stopped just short of contact, making Mike flinch. "You're that pro boxer," Mike said, his face pale. "The one from Brooklyn." "Amateur boxer," James corrected, "and now I'm just a pre-med student who would really like to get back to his studies." He turned to address the gathered crowd. "Show's over. Anyone who needs help with their technique, the boxing club meets on Tuesdays." As the crowd began to disperse, many filming the scene on their phones, Sarah approached the ring. "That was incredible, but why keep it a secret?" James sighed, beginning to unwrap his hands. "Because I wanted to be known for more than just my fists, but I guess some reputations follow you." By noon, videos of the morning's events had spread across campus social media. Students gathered in the dining hall, watching clips of both the gym confrontation and James's old boxing matches. The story grew with each telling, how Princeton's newest pre-med student was actually Brooklyn's undefeated boxing champion, how he had systematically dismantled the wrestling team's star without throwing a real punch. James sat alone in the library, trying to focus on his anatomy textbook, when David rushed in. "Dude, you're trending on the university's social networks. Why didn't you tell me my roommate was a boxing legend?" "Because I'm not," James replied firmly. "Not anymore." But as he walked to his next class, the whispers and stares following him told a different story. His two worlds had collided, and there was no going back. The only question was, could he find a way to be both Lightning Chen and James the pre-med student, or would one identity have to knock out the other? The aftermath of the morning's events rippled through Princeton like a shockwave. By afternoon, the campus was buzzing with different versions of what had happened in the gym. Some said James had knocked Mike out cold. Others claimed he'd embarrassed the entire wrestling team. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere in between. James sat in his advanced biology lecture, trying to focus on cellular metabolism while feeling the weight of dozens of curious stares. His phone kept vibrating with notifications. Old boxing forums had exploded with the news that Lightning Chen had resurfaced at Princeton. Even his former manager had called twice, probably sensing a comeback story in the making. As students filed out after class, a hand caught his shoulder. It was Mike, looking uncomfortable in his Princeton wrestling team jacket. The corridor quickly cleared as other students sensed the tension, though many lingered just within earshot. "Can we talk?" Mike asked, his usual bravado notably absent. "Privately?" James nodded, following him to an empty study room. Through the glass walls he could see students pretending not to watch them. Mike paced for a moment before speaking. "I looked you up after, you know." He ran a hand through his short hair. 38 wins, 35 knockouts. You could have really hurt me this morning." "That wasn't the point," James replied quietly. "Yeah, I'm getting that now." Mike leaned against a desk. "You know what really gets me? In all those videos, every interview after your knockouts, you always helped your opponents up. Checked if they were okay. Even that guy who trash-talked your grandmother before the Golden Gloves final." James remembered that fight well, the anger he'd felt, the temptation to really hurt his opponent. But his grandmother's voice had echoed in his head. "Your power isn't in how hard you can hit, Lightning. It's in knowing when not to." "Look," Mike continued, "I've been thinking. The wrestling team could use someone like you, not as a wrestler," he added quickly, seeing James's expression. "As a coach. Your understanding of movement, timing, control, it's incredible. You could teach us a lot." James studied Mike's face, seeing genuine respect there now. "I came here to study medicine, not fight." "Why not both?" Mike straightened up. "You clearly haven't lost any of your skills. And honestly, after this morning, half the campus wants to learn from you anyway. Why not do it officially?" Before James could respond, Sarah burst into the study room, slightly out of breath. "James, you need to see this." She held up her phone, showing him the Princeton University athletics website. There was a new announcement. Emergency meeting called to discuss student safety concerns following unauthorized boxing exhibition. "They're trying to make you look dangerous," Mike said, reading over James's shoulder. "That's messed up. We're defending someone from us." He looked genuinely ashamed. "I'll go to the meeting, tell them what really happened." James felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same he'd felt before big fights. But this wasn't an opponent he could outbox. This was exactly why he'd wanted to keep his past hidden. "We'll all go," Sarah declared. "Tommy's already gathering signatures from other students. You're not alone in this, James." The meeting was scheduled for 4 p.m. in the athletic department and conference room. As James approached the building, he was surprised to see a crowd of students gathered outside. Tommy stood on the steps, still looking nervous but determined, holding a tablet with what appeared to be hundreds of digital signatures. "They're trying to paint you as some kind of threat," Tommy explained. "But we've got testimonials from dozens of students about what really happened, about Mike and his team's friendly sparring matches too." He glanced apologetically at Mike, who nodded grimly. "Kid's right," Mike added. "Time to own up to everything." Inside the conference room, the athletic director, dean of students, and several board members sat around a large table. Their expressions were serious as James took his seat, with Sarah, Mike, and Tommy insisting on sitting beside him. "Mr. Chen," the athletic director began, "we have serious concerns about—" "If I may," Mike interrupted, standing up. "Before you start, I need to tell you what really happened this morning, and about all the other mornings before that." He proceeded to detail his own history of aggressive behavior, his intimidation of other students, and how James had actually de-escalated the situation using minimal force. The room fell silent as Mike finished his confession. The dean of students leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, is this true? You deliberately avoided causing harm." "I came to Princeton to heal people, not hurt them," James replied simply. "This morning, I used my skills to prevent violence, not cause it." Sarah pulled out her phone. "We have over 500 student signatures supporting James, plus video evidence showing his restraint. He's inspired people. The boxing club's membership has tripled today, with students specifically asking to learn about discipline and control." The athletic director exchanged looks with his colleagues. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we've been approaching this from the wrong angle. Mr. Chen, would you be interested in a formal position as a student instructor? Your experience could be valuable, properly channeled." James felt the weight of the moment. He'd tried to run from his past, but maybe it wasn't about running. Maybe it was about transforming what he'd learned in the ring into something that could help others. "I'll do it," he said finally. "On one condition. Mike helps me teach. He's learned something valuable about humility and responsibility. That's just as important as technique." As they left the meeting, Sarah nudged his shoulder. "So, Professor Chen, ready to show Princeton how a real champion carries himself?" James smiled, feeling truly at peace with both sides of himself for the first time since arriving on campus. "Lightning Chen was a fighter," he said. "But maybe James Chen can be something more. A teacher, a healer, and, yeah, still a fighter. When necessary, just a different kind of fight. News travels fast on a college campus, but social media moves even faster. By evening, James's story had exploded beyond Princeton's boundaries. His old boxing videos were trending again, now paired with shaky smartphone footage of his morning encounter with Mike. Comment sections filled with discussions about the pre-med boxing champion, and local news outlets began reaching out for interviews. James sat in his dorm room, staring at his phone as yet another sports blogger requested a comment. David watched from his desk, uncharacteristically quiet for a moment before speaking up. "You know, I've been your roommate for weeks now, and I never once suspected. I mean, I Googled you after everything went down today." He spun his chair around. "That knockout in the Golden Gloves semi-finals, when you slipped that right hand and came back with the counter. That was art, man." "That was a different life," James replied, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice now. He opened his laptop, and his email inbox was flooded. Former opponents sending respect, old gym mates asking if he was coming back to boxing, and most surprisingly, a message from his advanced biology professor. Mr. Chen, the email read, in light of recent events, I'd like to discuss your research proposal on traumatic brain injury in combat sports. Your unique perspective could add considerable value to our department's ongoing study. Please see me during office hours. A knock at the door interrupted his reading. Sarah stood there, holding her tablet, with Mike hovering awkwardly behind. Her, you need to see this, she said, entering the room. She pulled up the Princeton Student News website, where the top story featured a deep dive into James's boxing career. But instead of focusing on his knockouts, the article highlighted his academic achievements, his work with youth programs in Brooklyn, and his perfect GPA while training. They're calling you the scholar fighter, Mike said, pointing to the comments section. Look at what people are saying. The comments were overwhelmingly positive. Students shared stories about how James had helped them in study groups, never hinting at his past achievements. Others expressed admiration for how he'd handled the morning's confrontation, using his skills to diffuse rather than escalate. This isn't what I wanted, James sighed, running a hand through his hair. I came here to be a doctor, not a celebrity. Maybe you don't have to choose, Sarah suggested, sitting on the edge of his desk. That email from your bio professor? I heard about that study. They're researching ways to make combat sports safer. Who better to contribute than someone who's lived both sides of it? James was about to respond when his phone buzzed again. This time it was a FaceTime call from his grandmother. He hesitated before answering, putting it on speaker. Lightning. His grandmother's warm voice filled the room. I see you're making headlines again. I'm sorry, Grandma. I know I promised to leave that life behind. Who asked you to leave it behind? She interrupted. I supported you coming to Princeton because you wanted to heal people. From what I'm reading, that's exactly what you did today. But differently than we planned, James admitted. Life rarely goes as planned, Lightning, but it always goes as it should. Her voice carried years of wisdom. You think I didn't know this day would come? You can't run from who you are. You can only run toward who you're meant to be. Mike, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. Mrs. Chen. I'm the guy your grandson could have knocked out this morning, but chose not to. I just wanted to say he's already healing people, just not the way any of us expected. James's grandmother chuckled. Ah, so this is the wrestler I've been reading about. Good to hear your voice, young man. Perhaps you're both learning something valuable, yes? After the call ended, the room fell into thoughtful silence. David finally broke it with a snort. So, does this mean I can tell people my roommate is the famous Lightning Chen now? Famous is a stretch, James smiled, but his mind was racing with new possibilities. The research opportunity, the chance to help make combat sports safer, the ability to teach others about discipline and control. Maybe his past wasn't a burden to escape, but a foundation to build upon. Sarah touched his arm gently. You know what's really impressive? Not your record or your knockouts. It's how you've carried yourself through all this. That's what people are really responding to. She's right, Mike added. The team's been talking. What you showed this morning, it wasn't just skill. It was control, respect, everything combat sports should be about. That's why we want to learn from you. James stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the Princeton campus as evening settled in. Students crossed the quad, some undoubtedly, discussing the day's events. His two worlds had collided spectacularly, but instead of destruction, there was synthesis. The pre-med student and the boxing champion weren't separate identities to choose between. They were parts of a whole he was just beginning to understand. All right, he said finally, turning back to his friends. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. It's not just about throwing punches or winning fights. It's about responsibility, discipline, and using what we know to help others, Sarah grinned. There's the lightning Chen I've been reading about. So, Professor, when's our first lesson? James picked up his hand wraps from his desk, feeling their familiar texture. Tomorrow morning, 5 a.m. Let's see who's serious about learning. Mike groaned, but nodded. We'll be there, all of us. He paused. Just maybe go easy on the lightning-fast combinations at first. For the first time since his identity had been revealed, James laughed freely. The sound carried none of the tension he'd been holding since arriving at Princeton. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he was exactly who he needed to be. The following week saw James settling into an unexpected new routine. Each morning, he led training sessions that combined boxing technique with lessons about body mechanics and injury prevention. What started with Mike and a few curious wrestlers had grown into a dedicated group of students from various backgrounds, all eager to learn from the scholar fighter. But on this particular morning, as James wrapped up another successful session, Dr. Harrison, the dean of the medical school, waited at the edge of the gym. His presence, unusual at this early hour, caused a ripple of whispers among the students. "Mr. Chen," Dr. Harrison called out, "might I have a moment of your time?" James nodded to his students, signaling the end of practice. As they filed out, Sarah lingered behind, shooting him a concerned look before following the others. Once the gym cleared, Dr. Harrison approached, his expression unreadable. "Interesting session," the dean remarked, gesturing at the training equipment. "Very different from what I expected when I reviewed your medical school application last month." James felt his stomach tighten. He'd applied for Princeton's early admission medical program, hoping to secure his spot before his past could complicate things. "Sir, I can explain." "No need," Dr. Harrison interrupted, holding up a hand. "Your academic record speaks for itself. Perfect GPA, exceptional MCAT scores, glowing recommendations. But that's not why I'm here." He paused, studying James carefully. "I'm here because of a rather unique opportunity that's presented itself." From his briefcase, Dr. Harrison produced a folder. The National Boxing Commission is launching a comprehensive study on traumatic brain injury prevention. They're looking for someone with both medical knowledge and practical fighting experience to serve as a research assistant and consultant. He handed the folder to James. "The position comes with a full scholarship to medical school." James opened the folder, scanning the details. The opportunity was incredible. A chance to contribute to making the sport he loved safer while pursuing his medical career. But there was a catch. "This would require me to travel to several major fights," James noted, reading further. "To collect data, interview fighters, document injuries, and occasionally provide commentary and demonstrations," Dr. Harrison added. "The commission was quite impressed with the videos of your teaching methods here. They believe you could help bridge the gap between medical science and practical application." James sat heavily on a nearby bench. "This would mean postponing my medical studies for a year, while gaining invaluable research experience," Dr. Harrison countered. "Experience that could shape the future of combat sports medicine." He sat beside James. "You know, when I first learned about your boxing career, I wondered if it would conflict with your medical aspirations. But watching you these past weeks, how you teach, how you emphasize safety and control, I've realized they're not conflicting paths at all." Before James could respond, the gym door opened. Sarah walked in, followed by Mike and several other students. They carried printouts and tablets, looking excited despite the early hour. "Sorry to interrupt," Sarah said, "but you need to see this." She handed James a tablet open to a medical journal's website. "Remember that paper you helped me with, combining your boxing experience with current concussion research? It just got accepted for publication." Mike leaned over, pointing at another. document, and check this out. Applications for the new Combat Sports Safety Club we proposed. Over 50 students want to join, including pre-med and engineering majors. They want to learn about the science behind fighting while training safely. James looked from the research opportunity in his hands to the eager faces of his students. Dr. Harrison watched him thoughtfully. "Quite a choice you have to make," the dean observed. "Pursue groundbreaking research that could protect future fighters, or continue building something unique here at Princeton." James stood up, walking to the heavy bag he used for demonstrations. He ran his hand over its surface, feeling the familiar texture. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. "You can't run from who you are. You can only run toward who you're meant to be." "Dr. Harrison," James said finally, turning back to face them all, "what if we didn't have to choose? What if we could do both?" "I'm listening," the dean replied, leaning forward. "Princeton has one of the best medical research facilities in the country. Instead of me traveling to collect data, what if we brought the research here? We already have a growing group of students interested in both the practice and science of combat sports." James gestured to his gathered students. "We could establish a pilot program combining practical training with medical research." Sarah's eyes lit up. "The data we could collect on injury prevention, reaction times, impact force, and with subjects we work with daily. Plus," Mike added, "you'd be here to oversee both the training and the research. No one else has your combination of experience." Dr. Harrison stood, a slight smile playing at his corners of his mouth. "I suspected you might suggest something like this, which is why I took the liberty of discussing a potential partnership with the Boxing Commission beforehand." He pulled another document from his briefcase. "They're open to the idea, provided you would still consult on major fights during breaks. The scholarship would still apply." James felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a choice between fighting and healing anymore. It was a chance to transform both paths into something entirely new. "When do we start?" he asked. Dr. Harrison extended his hand. "The commission representatives will be here next week. I suggest you and your students prepare a demonstration of what you've been developing here. Show them why Princeton should be the home of this new approach to combat sports medicine." As the dean left, Sarah punched James's arm lightly. "See? Sometimes you don't have to choose between two paths. Sometimes you get to pave a new one." Looking at his gathered students, seeing their excitement and dedication, James realized she was right. Lightning Chen the boxer and James Chen the healer weren't opposing forces. They were two parts of a greater whole he was finally ready to become. The week before the Boxing Commission's visit transformed Princeton's athletic center into a hub of unprecedented activity. James stood in the center of the gym, now equipped with high-speed cameras and impact sensors, watching as his unlikely team of athletes and academics worked together. Mike, once his would-be opponent, now led a group of wrestlers through modified boxing combinations while wearing monitoring equipment. "Keep your form tight," he called out, echoing James's teachings. "Remember, we're not just training, we're demonstrating how proper technique prevents injury." Sarah coordinated with a team of engineering students who were setting up motion capture equipment. "If we can quantify the difference between proper and improper form," she explained to a visiting professor, "we can create better training protocols for fighters at all levels." The transformation wasn't just in the gym. Word had spread through academic circles about Princeton's innovative approach to combat sports research. Students from various departments, physics, biology, computer science, had joined the project, each bringing their unique perspectives. "Check this out," David called from behind his laptop. He'd written an algorithm to analyze fight footage. "We can predict potential injury risks based on a fighter's movement patterns." He looked up at James. "Who knew my coding skills would ever apply to boxing?" James watched it all with a mixture of pride and amazement. His two worlds weren't just coexisting. They were creating something entirely new, but not everyone was convinced. "Mr. Chen?" a voice called from the entrance. James turned to see Coach Reynolds, the old-school boxing coach from his amateur days in Brooklyn. The older man had driven up after hearing about the project. "Coach," James greeted him warmly, "I didn't expect you here until tomorrow." "Had to see this for myself," Reynolds replied, looking around skeptically. "All these computers and cameras. Boxing's about heart and grit, not spreadsheets and sensors." James led him through the gym, explaining their approach. "We're not trying to change the sport, Coach. We're trying to protect the fighters while helping them perform better." They stopped to watch Mike working with a group of beginners. His teaching style combined James's technical precision with his own wrestler's perspective on balance and leverage. "Remember," Mike was saying, "it's not about hitting harder, it's about hitting smarter." "That's what Chen taught me." Coach Reynolds watched silently, his expression softening slightly. "He's good with them," he admitted. "Different from how we used to teach." "Different doesn't mean worse," James replied. "Look at their form. Clean, efficient, safe. They're learning faster because they understand the why, not just the how." A commotion near the sensors drew their attention. One of the engineering students was excitedly showing Sarah some data. "The force distribution on proper technique versus sloppy form, the difference is incredible. We can actually quantify why proper form prevents injury." "That's what we're building here," James explained to his old coach. "A bridge between the old school and the new, between fighting spirit and scientific understanding." Reynolds watched as students moved between training stations, some throwing punches while others analyzed data. "Your grandmother told me you left boxing to become a doctor," he said finally. "Looks to me like you've found a way to be both." "Thanks to everyone here," James gestured at his team. "They showed me it was possible." Sarah approached them, tablet in hand. "James, the preliminary data is amazing. The commission is going to love this." She noticed Coach Reynolds. "You must be the man who trained lightning. We've studied your teaching methods. They're the foundation of our safety protocols." Reynolds straightened, surprised and pleased. "You're using my methods, combined with biomechanical analysis," Sarah explained enthusiastically. "Your emphasis on proper body alignment perfectly matches what our research shows about injury prevention." As they discussed the integration of traditional teaching with modern analysis, James noticed Mike working with Tommy, the same student whose bullying had started this whole journey. Now they moved like teammates, sharing insights and helping newer students. "It's not just about the research," James said softly. "Look at them. Former opponents becoming teachers, athletes becoming scientists, everyone learning from each. That's the real breakthrough here." Coach Reynolds nodded slowly. "You know, when I heard you'd left boxing for Princeton, I thought you were running away from who you are. But this," he gestured at the bustling gym, "this is something else. You're not running away or running toward. You're building something new." "We all are," James corrected him. "Every person here brings something unique. That's what makes it work." As the day wound down, James gathered everyone for a final meeting before tomorrow's presentation to the Boxing Commission. Students who once would never have crossed paths now sat together, athletes and academics united in a common goal. "Tomorrow's important," he told them, "but what we've built here, these connections, this understanding between different worlds, that's what really matters. Whatever happens with the commission, we've proved something valuable. Progress doesn't mean abandoning tradition. It means building bridges between the past and future." Looking at his transformed gym, at the faces of students who had become pioneers in their own right, James felt a deep sense of rightness. This was more than a research project or a training program. It was proof that sometimes the hardest hits, in life could lead to the most unexpected victories. The day of the Boxing Commission's visit dawned bright and clear. Princeton's largest lecture hall had been converted into a presentation space, with demonstrations planned in the adjacent gym. But what caught everyone by surprise was the crowd gathering outside. Not just students and faculty, but local coaches, fighters, and even a few familiar faces from James's Brooklyn days. Word got out, Sarah explained, showing James her phone. Local sports blogs had picked up the story. Princeton's scholar fighter revolutionizes combat sports training. Another headline read, "From boxing ring to research lab, the future of fighter safety." Inside the lecture hall, James watched as his worlds collided in the best possible way. Dr. Harrison sat, with Boxing Commission officials in the front row. Behind them, Princeton faculty mixed with boxing coaches from nearby gyms. Mike and his wrestling teammates sat alongside engineering students, all wearing newly printed Combat Sports Science Initiative t-shirts. "Ready for this?" Sarah asked. Adjusting the presentation equipment, James nodded, though his heart was racing faster than it had before any fight. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had helped build something revolutionary. The presentation began with data. Clear, compelling evidence of how their integrated approach was changing the way people learned and practiced combat sports. Sarah presented injury prevention statistics, while Mike demonstrated practical applications with his team. Traditional training methods have a 40% higher risk of training-related injuries, Sarah explained, showing comparative data. By integrating biomechanical analysis with traditional techniques, we've reduced that risk significantly while improving performance. David showcased his prediction algorithm, now refined through weeks of testing. We can identify potentially dangerous movement patterns before they lead to injury, he explained, running footage of before and after training sessions. The software provides real-time feedback, helping fighters correct their form instantly. But the most powerful moment came when Tommy stepped forward. The once timid student now stood confidently before the commission. "3 months ago, I was being bullied," he stated clearly. "Now I'm part of a team that's changing how people think about combat sports. We're not just learning to fight. We're learning to understand the science behind it, to respect both the power and responsibility that comes with these skills." James watched as the commission members leaned forward, clearly engaged, but it was the next speaker who really captured their attention. Mike stood up, his wrestling jacket replaced by a lab coat. "I used to think strength was about domination," he admitted. "Thanks to this program, I learned it's about protection and progress. We're not just preventing injuries. We're building a community where athletes and academics work together to make combat sports safer and more accessible." During the break between presentations, James overheard 2 commission members talking. "Never seen anything like this," one said. "The data is solid, but it's the cultural change that's impressive. Combining rigorous research with practical application," the other agreed. "This could be a model for programs nationwide." The afternoon session moved to the gym for practical demonstrations. Students showcased their modified training methods while real-time data displayed on large screens. Local coaches asked questions, took notes, and even participated in some demonstrations. "See how the force distribution changes with proper technique," Sarah explained to a group of visiting trainers. "We're not changing the fundamental moves, we're just understanding them better." A young boxer from a nearby gym raised his hand. "So you're saying we can hit more effectively while staying safer?" "Exactly," James stepped in. "It's not about compromising power for safety. It's about maximizing both through understanding." The impact of their work became even clearer when Coach Reynolds addressed the crowd. "I've been training fighters for 30 years, he began. "Thought I knew everything there was to know. But what these kids have shown us," he gestured around the gym, This is the future of our sport. As the day wound down, Dr. Harrison gathered everyone for a final announcement. The Boxing Commission has seen enough, he declared. They're not just approving our program, they're recommending it as a pilot for other universities. Princeton will become the first center for combat sports science and safety in the country. The crowd erupted in cheers, but James's attention was caught by a small group of high school students who had been watching from the back. One of them approached him hesitantly. "Is it true we could study both?" the teenager asked. "Like become doctors and still stay connected to boxing?" James looked around at what they'd built, athletes discussing research methods, academics learning proper punching technique, former rivals working together toward a common goal. "That's exactly what we're doing here," he replied. "Breaking down the walls between different worlds and building something better." The impact of their work had grown beyond anything James had imagined when he first arrived at Princeton. What started as an attempt to hide his past had transformed into a movement that could change the future of combat sports. And somewhere in Brooklyn, he knew his grandmother was smiling, proud of the bridge he'd helped build between the fighter he was and the healer he was becoming. 1 year later, James stood at the podium in Princeton's largest auditorium, facing a packed house of students, faculty, and distinguished guests. Behind him, a banner read, "First Annual Combat Sports Science Symposium." The journey from hidden boxer to pioneering researcher had been remarkable, but what made him proudest was seeing how many lives had been transformed along the way. Mike sat in the front row, now a certified trainer and research assistant, wearing his head coach jacket from the Combat Sports Science program. Beside him, Sarah reviewed her notes for her presentation on injury prevention protocols that were being adopted by boxing commissions across the country. David had his laptop open, probably making last-minute adjustments to the training analytics. Software that was revolutionizing how fighters prepared for competition. "When I first came to Princeton," James began, his voice steady and confident, "I thought I had to choose between two worlds, the fighter I was and the doctor I wanted to become. I tried to hide my past, thinking it would hold me back from my future." He paused, looking out at the faces before him. "I was wrong." In the audience, he spotted Tommy, now a sophomore and one of their most promising student researchers. The once timid freshman had found his confidence, combining his love for science with a newfound appreciation for martial arts. Next to him sat Coach Reynolds, who had become a regular guest lecturer on traditional training methods and their scientific foundations. "What we've built here isn't just a program or a research initiative," James continued. "It's proof that our perceived limitations often become our greatest strengths when we stop running from them and start building with them." The screen behind him displayed images from the past year. Students working with high-tech equipment, fighters applying scientific principles to their training, researchers and athletes collaborating to solve complex problems. Each photo told a story of barriers broken and bridges built. Today, we have representatives from 12 universities here to learn about implementing similar programs on their campuses. We have boxing commissions from 3 countries studying our safety protocols. But most importantly, we have proof that when we embrace all parts of who we are, we can create something greater than we imagined. James gestured to Mike, who stood and joined him at the podium. "A year ago, Mike and I were opponents. Today, we're colleagues working toward the same goal. That's the real power of what we've discovered. Not just the science of fighting, but the art of turning conflict into collaboration." Mike took the microphone, his transformation evident in his confident but humble demeanor. "James taught me that true strength isn't about dominating others. It's about lifting them up. Every student who comes through our program learns that same lesson." As Mike spoke, James's phone buzzed with a text from his grandmother. "Lightning, You didn't just find your path, you created one for others to follow. So proud of my champion healer. The symposium continued, with presentations from students and faculty, each highlighting different aspects of their groundbreaking work. But what struck James most was watching the interactions between participants. Fighters discussing research methodology with professors, scientists learning proper technique from coaches, students from different disciplines finding common ground in their shared passion for understanding human performance. As the day drew to a close, a young freshman approached James, carrying both medical textbooks and hand wraps. I used to think I had to choose between my love for boxing and my dream of becoming a doctor, she said. But you showed us we don't have to choose. We can be both. James smiled, remembering his own journey. We can be more than both, he replied. We can be pioneers. Later that evening, as James wrapped up some paperwork in his office, now split between the medical school and the athletic center, he found himself reflecting on the past year. The walls displayed both his boxing achievements and his academic accomplishments, no longer segregated but integrated, telling the complete story of who he was. Sarah appeared in his doorway, excitement in her eyes. The National Institutes of Health approved our grant proposal. We're getting full funding for the expansion of the program. Perfect timing, James replied. I just got word from the Boxing Commission. They want to make our safety protocols mandatory for all sanctioned fights. They shared a moment of satisfied silence, both remembering how this all started with a confrontation in a college gym. Now that same gym was a beacon of innovation and collaboration, proving that sometimes the best path forward is the one you create yourself. Ready to call it a day, Professor Chen? Sarah asked with a grin. James looked at his hand wraps, still sitting next to his medical journals. Almost, he said. Just need to finish something first. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. When it connected, he smiled. Hey, Grandma, remember how you said I couldn't run from who I am? Well, I think I finally figured out what you meant. I'm not running anymore, I'm building, and I'd love for you to come see what we've created here. As he ended the call, James looked out his window at the Princeton campus. Students were heading to evening training sessions, carrying both scientific equipment and boxing gear, representing a future he never imagined but now couldn't picture any other way. He'd come here trying to escape his past, only to discover that embracing it would lead him to his greatest contribution, not just as a fighter, not just as a healer, but as someone who proved that the greatest victories come from being truly, completely yourself. If you enjoyed this story about transformation, perseverance, and the power of embracing all parts of who you are, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who might need to hear this message. Sometimes, our greatest perceived weaknesses become our strongest assets when we stop hiding them and start building with them.